Welcome to the Lost Boys to Found Fathers podcast. I'm Gabe O'Sullivan, and joining me is my co-host Will Haycox. We are men who have suffered the loss of a child, and through this production we desire to offer encouragement, strength, and hope to our fellow brothers who have traveled the same journey. On today's podcast, we have a very distinguished guest, Mr. Steve Grant. He is the author of a book, Don't Forget Me, a lifeline of hope for those touched by substance abuse and addiction. This book has actually been mentioned by the Wall Street Journal. He has a foundation called Chris and Kelly's Hope. He has a website, don'tforgetmebook.com and chriskellyhope.org. Mr. Grant has experienced a similar situation, but different than Will and I, and we're so thankful to have him here, and we really appreciate it. So with that, I'm going to throw it over to Will and allow him to introduce our guest and get started with the questions.
Hey guys, thank you for that introduction, Gabe. Yeah, we kind of talked about some of our hopes for this podcast, where we wanted to go, and how we wanted to offer encouragement to all the guys out there that are listening to this. And one of our things that we really wanted to do is get some other men in here and do an interview and just get to know them and their story, and hopefully offer some more encouragement from different perspectives for people who have gone through the loss of a child in different ways that we have. And so I got connected to Mr. Grant, and we've been discussing for a month or so, trying to get time to get in here and do an interview and learn about his sons. And we finally gotten here to this point, so we're excited to have him on, and we hope this is the first of many interviews that we get to have with men, and just offer you some encouragement, and just to know that you're not alone in your loss, and that there are other guys out there who have lost a child and are learning to hope in the Lord through that loss. So without further ado, I wanted to introduce you, Mr. Grant, and get you on here. We talked about your name, Steve Grant, and you are currently living in Greenville, South Carolina. Would you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure, and I really appreciate the opportunity of being here today. It means a great deal to me, more than you guys know. I'm Steve Grant. I live in Greenville, South Carolina, born in Paramus, New Jersey, which is right outside of New York City. That's where I grew up, and loved growing up there, and got a small baseball scholarship to Furman, and came down here to play baseball, and never went back. So I've been in the financial services business for 40 years here in Greenville, and the particulars about this conversation is I did lose two sons to accidental drug overdoses, one in 2005 and one in 2010. And I always like to tell people, we do a lot of these, and say that my kids were ahead of their time. That today it's a big deal, but in 2005 I had no idea, I had no knowledge of anyone that died of a drug overdose, and actually in 2010 the only one I knew was his brother. So and the unique thing about my situation is they both died in very different ways. One was addicted to drugs and alcohol at an early age, 14, and spent the next 8 years in and out of drug rehabs, 5 rehabs, boarding schools. One of those situations that when a lot of parents call me today, they always seem to talk about my son Christopher. Not actually talk about him. That when they talk about their son, they're talking about him, and it's not humorous. It's kind of it's kind of wow. I know where this story's going, but it is your story. It's unique to you, but the behavior and the is very similar. On the other hand, my other son was at College of Charleston. He signed a record deal with a music company, and he someone introduced him to heroin, of all things, right from the start. And 8 months later, he died. So it was a very different path to the same result, unfortunately. Mm-hmm. And so, after that, the Lord was always in my life. I always tell some people this funny story about meeting my closest friend, a guy named John Lady, who's an investment guy in Greenville, and he's got 4 kids. Clemson. All his kids went to Clemson. His wife went to Clemson. But I met him one day, and I interviewed him for a job in Greenville one morning, and one Saturday morning, and I saw that big, huge Bible in the front seat of his car, and I go, okay, who is this dude? Let's talk to this morning.
Right.
And he comes in, and we kind of always laugh about this day. And we're talking, and he's talking to me, and He ended up came and worked with us, but I could tell that he was very devoted to the Lord. And I'd say I was devoted to the Lord too, but not the way he was devoted to the Lord. And so after about a month or so at work, our office manager was a devout Christian woman. Her name was Sandra. And John goes to Sandra, "Hey, is Steve Christian?" Like that. And she said, "Steve's the most Christian non-Christian I've ever met." And I didn't really know how to take that when I heard how she said that. But I soon learned after that from John, subtly over time, what that really meant. And so he was very instrumental in my walk with the Lord today, and understanding that the true walk and what that means. And so it's been a very good friendship. I've caught him many times on the phone when obviously he's talking about me with somebody. And before I get in to see him, he'll say, "Steve's Catholic." Steve's Catholic. And I'm like, "John, why do you make this sound like Steve's got cancer? Steve's sick. He's terminal. Just because I'm Catholic." But we always kid about those things. The funny thing about it, the whole thing, is I'm now married. My second wife, Kathy, is a Church of God pastor's daughter.
Wow.
And who's never been married, never had children, and it's my age. And her sister's never been married, never had children. Two very beautiful girls, and you wonder why until you meet their dad. And so we have this Catholic and this we get along great.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
That's cool. So you mentioned just a little bit there about your sons and what they went through. Would you tell us a little more about, what was their story like? You mentioned Christopher became addicted at 14, was in and out of boarding schools. I know there'll be some people out there that are maybe going through, maybe going through that journey now with their children, or have gone through it and have lost a child. What was that like as a father to see them going through that, and to know what was best for them, and to know what you wanted for them, but you couldn't make the decisions for them? Would you talk a little bit about how you dealt with that?
Yeah, it's hard. I was very close with both my sons, so and they were honest with me to a certain point, and that point always got a little further out as they got older, which I think is a natural thing for a father and a son. You don't going to hear everything that goes on, I underestimated how close actually the two of them were, but we were very close. And you have a show here that talks about fathers and the relationship with their children. In my world, the people that I talk to, unfortunately, it's rarely ever the father that has the relationship with the children who have trouble with drugs and alcohol. It's normally their mother. It's normally the female in their life, mother person. So it's funny, I go to these meetings, and I have a not-for-profit, and I'm on a not-for-profit board called the Family Effect in Greenville, and then another not-for-profit, and I'm like the only guy in the room.
Wow.
Because most of these things are run by women, and they usually, the person I usually am speaking to on the phone, 99 times out of 100, I get these calls once a week from some woman in some part of the country about their son or their daughter, but it's the mother. It's rarely ever the father, which I think is a shame. And I don't know what that really means in that process. But phone conversations that I have that are three-way like this are typically divided, because they rarely are the two people. Because that's one of my first questions: are you two guys on board on this? Are you guys consistent with this? Which is everybody's challenge in parenting, right? You guys are both parents.
Yes, sir.
It's hard to be on the same page. But when you talk about, there was an article actually in the Wall Street Journal last week, and I'm on the board at the Medical University of South Carolina in Charleston, where there's a group called CDAP, Center for Drug and Alcohol Programs, and it was a very good article they sent me that was in the Wall Street Journal about how do you talk to your children about drugs and alcohol. What are the things and what are the signs? Because interestingly enough, the signs are there. A lot of what my book goes into is the why and how. And as I told you, as I wrote down in the little questionnaire you guys sent me briefly as a guide, that there's I don't have any regrets, but I would do things different. I would do some things differently.
Right.
Yeah. Like you say, I think that's a tough thing. My wife and I just have a 4-month-old daughter, but inevitably there'll be something, whether it's drug addiction, whether it's some other sin, there'll inevitably be something that we're struggling with. How do we deal with it? How do we discuss that with her? How do we offer her the wisdom that we've gained in our lives and try to hope that she listens? What advice, you mentioned that, there's some things that you would do differently. What would you do differently if you would offer that? And what would you tell a couple that's either currently going through that or just went through it and they're dealing maybe with that guilt, thinking, if I'd only done this differently, if I'd only done that differently, how would you tell them to draw closer to each other and to draw closer to the Lord in the middle of that?
Yeah, and I remember many nights with the boy's mother, my wife at the time. We were married for 25 years, and I remember many nights lying there praying at night, wondering where our son was. This is the older one, where our older son was. He should have been home, but he's not. Don't know where he is. And you remember, this is before technology was really good. Because you do all the standard things. You take away the you take away the telephones, you take away the cell phones, you do all those kind of things, and then almost you're at a loss though when you do those things. So your communication. So we did a lot of praying. And both my sons were close to the Lord. They both went to faith-based schools. Supposedly faith-based schools,
Yeah.
but they were certainly taught. And one of the interesting things about our family is there's a lot to be said for doing things consistently and unified. Well, we didn't do a lot of things consistently and unified, so that would be one regret. The only thing we did consistent and unified was we went to church on Sunday. And my older son especially, there were times where one, he was not physically able to go to church because of the night before, but he got up and went to church. It was an expectation. And it wasn't like I had to drag him out of the kids. It's time to get up. And he just knew it. And I knew he didn't want to be there. Now, he might have slept through it, but he was there. And it was interesting how that was always something that we did right from day one. And, it was, it's like brushing your teeth in the morning on Sunday. You knew where you were going on Sunday morning. So and I kind of look back at that and fault my wife and I that we weren't as consistent in other areas. And I think if anything, once you have children, those areas become more glaring that you don't, that you really aren't on the same page on. I went to. I had the pleasure of meeting James Dobson about 6 months ago. It's funny, in my book, the editor, the publisher is in Dallas, Texas. The editor is in New York City, and all three that I dealt with are devout Christians, and they all said, "Do not make a biblically based book, Steve." So I said, well, that's perfect because I don't know how to make a biblically based book. So that's fine with me. But you know that when it came out, it was the #1 seller on Amazon in the drug and alcohol category.
Wow.
But the people that wanted to hear me speak and talk were people of faith.
Wow.
So like the 700 Club, those types of groups. So I got a chance to talk to James Dobson.
Wow.
A little bit, and he said he called me and we spoke, and I said, Dr. Dobson, I'm really thrilled that you're talking to me, and I said, I read all your books that you wrote. And he said, which ones? I said, I don't remember the names. I remember where they were on my shelf, but I'll tell you one thing, I read them too late.
Oh, wow.
I read all of them, but I read them too late. I said, I also went to a class called Growing Kids God's Way, which is a couple out in California named the Ezzos.
Yes.
And I did that. I did it when the kids were 15.
Yeah.
And everybody else in the group, my wife was begging me to do it. I was busy working. I coached a lot of teams. I started the baseball team at St. Joseph's High School. I built the field there, you know. So I had a lot of things going on. I was there coaching all the time, their games. So to take out 6 weeks, 3 nights a week for 6 weeks was just not in the plan. And I don't like to join things and not be able to fulfill it. So finally, my wife really, I acquiesced to her to do that. And I remember leaving there one time, and and again, these were couples I know a lot of them to this day at their house. These were 6-8 couples. We had kids that were 13 and 15. They had kids that were either the bun was in the oven still, or was just born. So this is where you really kind of catch this, you know, this thing. And we were sitting there where the kids were already starting to have my 13-year-old, 14, 15-year-old was already having trouble. So we went there, and I remember leaving there one time in the street, and I was crying, and I said to my wife, I said, "Honey, I apologize to you." You know, she said, "What for?" I said, "That guy, Mr. Ezza, said that, you know, our children are a welcome addition to an already existing family. And my family, I always thought my family started when Christopher was born. I didn't think my family started when you and I got married."
Wow.
And it was a big aha moment, and it really was, because and that's just, and that if I heard anything that made the greatest sense, it was that that your children are a welcome addition to an already existing family.
Yeah, I think that's important. Like you say, you know, for for my wife and I especially, that just now have a 4-month-old child, and anyone else that's that new to being a parent, I think it's an easy thing to think, and I've caught myself thinking that too, that, you know, my wife and I are together and we're a couple, but we're not necessarily a family yet.
Right.
And you have that child, and then you're like, okay, now I've started a family. I need to wrap my mind around what that means. What does it mean to be a father? What does it mean to lead a family? And I think that's an important thing, and maybe that's a cultural thing. Maybe that's just a lack of development that we do as men, you know, whatever that is, whatever that block is. I think that's an important point that you mentioned there, that you need to start reframing your thought process about a marriage as setting that foundation for what your children will grow up in the future.
Yeah.
That's a good point.
Yeah, I mean, I remember physically being in the driveway and someone delivering diapers or something to our house in Greenville, and I'm sitting there thinking that I think I might have even said, I said, you know, honey, we've committed an unselfish act, and now we have to make Christopher our priority, which was nonsense at the end of the day. You know, we want to keep him comforted, and we want to make sure he has everything he needs to grow up with, you know, and to grow up safely. But I was basically saying, here's the pecking order now: Christopher, you, and me. You know, or some variation, but definitely right. Christopher was at the front of that of the pack. Instead, it should have been my wife, myself, and then our son. But it just didn't start. So that would be my regret. You know, we talk about grief and things like that, and you guys have gone through your forms of grief. I think grief many times is built on guilt, and the grief of my kids. I know I grieved, but I also knew that I did everything I could for them while they were alive and while they were struggling, and try to help them get through all this. So that part of it, I think that's why you maybe you don't see a lot of men in where I'm doing talking, because they may come back and they feel like, you know, boy, I should have done this, or I should have done that, or I should have been more supportive, I should have taken that problem more seriously than I did, that kind of thing.
Well, I appreciate you sharing that and that openness, you know, because that's, you know, the title of this podcast is Lost Boys and Found Fathers. You know, what you have just given us as young fathers is like some amazing nuggets, you know, of wisdom of this is how you be a father, right? This is how you move from boyhood, which most of us are in for the majority of our lives, right? But trying to become better men. And one way we can do that is, just like you said, we put God first, our wife second, our kids third. and in that order, and that is what establishes that healthy family. Just like you said. And it doesn't mean that we're going to be immune from our kids, unfortunately, getting hooked in with the wrong crowd and trying something that their body really loves and they can't give up. As we talked before, I've kind of seen that from a brotherly perspective with my younger brother, and knowing, that, man, my parents, like you, they were doing what they knew how to do to the best of their ability to try to help him, and in the end, he still takes his life due to drugs. But again, the things that you have said right there are just so amazing and such. I hope these our listeners are hearing what you're saying, that the priority is Lord, wife, kids, and that's a good basis for starting that family, and then hoping that out of that, maybe some things turn out differently. We don't know, but maybe they do.
Yeah, and you don't know, because you can only protect them from so much. Yeah. The devil's got a big old suitcase he's walking around with, and he's out there at every turn, and just when you think you might have something fixed or something solved, it's recreated in some other fashion. And children growing up today is very difficult, and you've had some suicide in your family. I have not, fortunately, had any suicide in my family. Have had plenty of death, but that's I worked. I was the chairman of the Mental Health Association in Greenville as a volunteer, and I won a couple of national awards with my company, Northwestern Mutual. National awards for my work with the mentally ill, and it to this day, it's I can't imagine where someone would have to be in their mind, in their place, to take their life. Mm-hmm. That makes me so sad that I did this. I started the suicide crisis hotline in Greenville 30 years ago, where someone would pick up the phone, and I did the training. And I did the training because I wanted to actually study for some advanced designations in my field, and I thought I would do that in the evenings. So I went through the training to answer the phone, and it's typically when someone calls in their life, they're ready to take their life, or they're certainly contemplating, they want to talk to somebody. So they call this assist line or helpline, and the job was to try to figure out where they were without letting them know where you were. Okay, and so you got all the language and you heard all the language. Well, I was on the phone with this girl for 2 hours the first night I was there, and wow. I put down the phone, didn't know what happened to her, went home, and my wife said, "How'd it go?" I said, "I'm not doing it again." And she said, "Well," I said, I won't sleep tonight. I'm not sure if I'll sleep another couple of nights wondering whatever happened to that poor girl." Because it's just, to get to that point, it's a very desperate thing.
Yes, sir.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you mentioned, the hopelessness that you have to be in, and that you have to really believe to be at that point where you're willing and ready to take your life. And I think that's something that we've mentioned here a few times, but what would you tell us what your relationship with God was like when you lost your sons, and how was that helpful? How did that draw you closer to Him and give you hope for the future, rather than leading you down a path of despair mm-hmm. that may or may not lead to that mindset where you think the only way out is to kill yourself?
Yeah, and I've had friends that have said to me, "Steve, I don't understand how you're still with us. One thing's to lose one child, but lose another child, and you're only 2 children." And I never thought about once worrying about my getting to that point where life's not worth living. Mm-hmm. I guess that's just how I'm made up of. Mm-hmm. But I obviously the shock of it. Now, my first son, we had done so much for him that the death was inevitable. So literally the day I found him in his bedroom dead, yes, I was stunned, but it was an expectation. It was an expectation, and not that we wanted it to happen, but we certainly didn't. But it was just an expectation. So I think we were somewhat prepared. My second son, who died of a heroin overdose, we didn't know really the extent of the whole situation, but we were shocked that he died. He died with one needle mark in his body, which meant he was trying to stop. But you go back to typically when you stop and you go start again, you go back to where you left off. You don't go back starting again. And today with fentanyl and things like that, you just don't. People talk about you got to let your children sink to the bottom, or let your husband or wife sink to the bottom. Well, the bottom's pretty. You don't know where the bottom is. The bottom can be pretty close these days. So that rule's kind of that's a big challenge when I talk to parents about letting them sink to the bottom. Because and I don't really talk about it too much because the bottom's pretty close these days. But I never waned in my love of the Lord. I never blamed the Lord for this. Why this happened to me, Lord? Why me? My mother did. My father did. And I always maintain, even when I speak and when you read the book, that I know I'm going to see my children again. I'm very convinced of that. In fact, two things that were really interesting that happened to me. I had an Eastern Indian physician client in Greenville, and he was a weird guy. His wife worked as a physician here in town also, and although he was licensed, he never practiced, and I never really understood why. But I was in the parking lot of one of the strip centers down in Greenville, off of Haywood Road, and he stopped me, and he knew that my second son had passed away, and he started quoting these Bible verses to me, and of course I didn't really understand any of it till later. But basically he said, and you guys might know him, basically it means that I was sort of picked, that this was God's plan, and I had already known that this was God's plan. Now you question the plan certainly, but it is the plan, and that's why I never fought it, that it was the plan. And I know I'm going to see my children again. But he went even further to say that Steve, you were chosen because you were going to do something about this, So many people either say they're going to, but they never do. And a lot of people just never, ever will. Like my ex-wife, for instance. She will never do what I've done. For whatever reason, that's hers, and I respect that. But my kids knew, even when I was going through my interventions with them, that one of the promises that I had to sometimes make to them was, the negotiation was like, hey, Dad, I know you know the liquor store owner that I'm buying liquor from on Church Street. He's already told me that that if you tell your dad that I'm going to lose my family and I'm going to lose my business. Now you tell that enough to a 13-year-old boy, he's going to believe you. They conditioned them. So when I did my rudimentary intervention with him, he said, Dad, you got to promise me one thing if I go to rehab. You're not going to put that liquor store owner out of business. He's got a wife. He's got kids. This is how they do it. And I'm going, okay. I said, well, I promise I won't. I ended up doing that, but it was far later on down the road. But at the time, you say those things and you do those things. And then in case you go fast forward, so Christopher dies in 2005. We kind of rock along. 2010 comes along. I have some issues in between. You read the book. I end up checking myself into a rehab facility for a little while because I was medicating through alcohol, and I spent a night in jail one night on the anniversary of my first son's death because I got pulled over, and unfortunately I just got a reckless driving, not a DUI. But regardless, it was the way I was managing this, the way I was handling this. My mom, we lost my sister growing up when I was a freshman at Firm, and my sister died. And my mother never drank, and then all of a sudden she started drinking. And she was medicating herself, and it's funny how the fruit doesn't roll far from the tree. And here I was doing the same exact thing, losing my first son. But I got over that, and then unfortunately my second son passed away. And it was December of 2010. Well, in January 2011, I had to be at a sales meeting. And it was two guys from St. Louis who, if you go on the internet today, you don't have to go very far to find John O'Leary or Ben Newman. They were international speakers. Well, in 2010, they were not international speakers. They were fledgling guys trying to make it to be international speakers. And they were in the Chamber of Commerce in Greenville, South Carolina.
Wow.
and there was about 50 people, and I knew some of the people, but nobody really knew my situation. Here was 2 weeks after Kelly died, and the guy in my office said, "Steve, I need a little gray hair. Will you please go?" And I said, "Boy, John, I'll tell you, I really don't want to go." And the reason I said was that I was out here. I was 30 some odd years in the financial service business. Not that I know everything, but I knew the group, and I said, I'm really not, I don't know how it's gonna benefit me. But I said, I'll be a good soldier. I'll go. So, and this is how God works in your life. So I went, reluctantly, not kicking and screaming, but reluctantly.
Right.
And the two guys got up there because I think they're going to talk to me how I'm going to be a better salesperson, better business person. They start by saying the G word, which you don't hear too much in an open forum today, unfortunately. And I'm going, that's interesting. And then they said, we're not here to help you be better business people. We're here for a 3-day boot camp to help you crystallize what it's going to be when you leave, what your legacy is going to be when you leave this life.
Wow.
And I of course went, whoa, wait a second, what's this all about now? This is a little different. I missed the storyline here somehow.
Right.
So I was pretty perked up. And so they go around the room in the first 15, 20 minutes of this thing and said, look, we want to hear what your legacy is now. And a lot of people are your age, you're young, might not know what your legacy in life is, right? But so a lot of people in their 20s don't know what their legacy in their life is going to be. I wasn't sure even at that point. And after Christopher died, I'm a very helpful guy. I'm going to tell you, that knows me, Stacy will tell you, give someone a shirt off my back, because it really doesn't mean that much to me. So with all that said, they start going around the room and they said, well, tell us today what you think your legacy in life is going to be. And after 3 days, it may change, So they go around the room, and I'm sort of sitting at, I'm at the top of the thing. You guys are two speakers. I'm all at the top, just looking at you. They get to me, and I stand up, and I go, I don't know what happened here, but I tell people every day that this is God's voice, not mine. But I said that I'm going to be the person known to help help adolescents and young adults who struggle with addiction, substance abuse, and accidental overdoses and mental illness. And the guy said, why would you do that? And then I told him why. I had lost my 2 kids. Well, I had drawn the line in the sand at that point, but I had no intention, zero intention, Gabe and Will, when I walked in there to say that. Zero. And that's how eventually this foundation got started, and we've raised a little bit south of $1 million in 7 years, and I've given out most of it. My checking account stays at about $1,000. And yesterday, a lady on Myrtle Beach who has a facility for young women. It has to be not for profit. It has to be, it has to be vetted. And I said, look, I got $1,000, and she said it's 12. I said, I know it's 1,200. I said, I'll just write you a check for 200 out of my pocket, and I'll give you 1,000 that's I got left in the foundation's account, because money does come in. Money comes in almost daily now. So that's kind of what we do.
Man, that's amazing. And like you said, the fact that I love it. You said that line in the sand was drawn, and it wasn't even drawn by you. Because, like you said, you didn't go to that thing with an intention of doing that.
Nothing.
And that goes right back to what it said about your physician friend that just randomly catches you in the parking lot and starts quoting the scripture about how you've been, predestined, and God chose you, and He's got a plan for you. And again, sometimes obviously that plan is hard, right? But we know that it's for good, right? It's for His good. It's for the good of millions of others that your life has impacted, and your boys' lives have impacted. And man, thank you for being like obedient to that, because you could have just been like, no.
Well, a lot of people are, and a lot of people are, and that's okay. And that's okay. I can't imagine this 2010. I was 53 at the time, maybe somewhere around there. Let's just say I had another 40 years to live, God willing. I would have hated to live the next 40 years miserable.
Yes.
Now, am I miserable sometimes? Sure.
Right.
Sure. I mean, every day I drive down 385 from my new wife's home on Woodruff Road, and I passed the area where my son flipped his car. You know, before they put all those trees in the center of on 385 going to downtown. You know, he drove home in the rain one time away from fleeing somebody, flipped his car. Could have died that day, but he didn't. Now I remember that, and I go past Christ Church's playground. Where I used to toot the horn when he was about this big. He was sitting there. So, you know, every day I see something that reminds me of my kids. And I guess I could go one way or the other. Unfortunately, I kind of say, okay, well, that was the plan was, and they were here for the time they were supposed to be here.
That's right.
Yeah, I think, you mentioned that your friend, the doctor friend, that had some verses and just encourage you there that the Lord chose you, and that allowed you to go through what you did with your sons for good. And we just finished a 5-6 part series on why would God allow my child to die, and we explored the goodness of God and the sovereignty of God and hope and what we believe is the purpose for suffering. And we just kept coming back to Romans 5:1-5, and that says, "Therefore, since we have been justified by faith, we have peace with God through our Lord Jesus Christ. Through him we have also obtained access by faith into this grace in which we stand, and we rejoice in the hope of the glory of God. Not only that, but we rejoice in our sufferings, knowing that suffering produces endurance, and endurance produces character, and character produces hope. And hope does not put us to shame, because God's love has been poured into our hearts through the Holy Spirit who's been given to us." And we just kept going back to, if we follow the chain there, that we rejoice in our sufferings because suffering produces hope. And I think suffering doesn't produce hope in everyone. Certainly, suffering is a horrible thing to go through, something we would never ask for or seek out. But if you suffer and you do that without the Lord, it probably does produce, like we had talked about, that sense of despair. And if it's something that you lost a child or you lost a spouse, you feel like, how can I keep going? What's the point? What's the meaning for life? But if you trust the Lord and you lean into him in your suffering, that, like it talks about, suffering produces endurance, and that endurance comes from the strength of the Holy Spirit. And endurance produces character, and that character comes from the way that the Holy Spirit renews your heart, renews your mind, and then that character produces hope, and that's hope in the Lord, and hope in what you talked about, seeing your sons again one day. And I felt the same way when I lost our son, when my wife and I lost her son Gabriel. I had that sense of loss, and all that I dreamed for him here, and the relationship we were going to have, and all the things that I hoped would happen. But I knew it wasn't the end, that today, tomorrow, 50 years from now, whenever I die, I know where he is and I'll go to see him. And so I think that's an important thing that you don't have if you're not a Christian. That I can't imagine, Gabe and I have talked about this, going through grief and not having that hope, because it is, if you believe, as some friends of mine do, when you die, it all goes black and that's the end. Like, where is the hope in that? You've lost someone and they're gone, and you'll never get them back. You'll never see them again. And so I think that's something that we've gone back and forth on and talked about several times in just the most recent episodes we've done. And you've already touched on that, like having that chance to trust the Lord through the hardest time in your life really changes you. And like you've obviously done, you've allowed the Lord to use you to change your heart, to change, maybe in small ways, maybe in big ways, your character, so that the loss of your child is something that can be used for good. And you mentioned how much money you've raised in the different nonprofits that you have been able to help, and you may never know, maybe you do know, but you may never know the people whose lives you've impacted, and by extension your children have impacted. And like I say, we'll never know. There could be 2 people whose lives have been saved. There could be 100 people, 1,000 people whose lives have been changed or saved through the loss of your children. And I think that's something that, everyone, like you mentioned, who goes through the loss of a child may not be moved or may not have the the strength or the headspace to start a nonprofit and to do what you've done. But even in a small way, at this point we've done 12 episodes of this podcast, so we're certainly not on the scale that you're on, and we may have someone else who's listening to this who they haven't talked to anyone about their grief because they're so fresh in it. But I think that's something that we should try to keep in mind, is your child's loss isn't for nothing. It's something that if you trust the Lord and you allow Him to speak to you and use you like you did at that meeting, it's not this horrible thing that's the end of something. It can be the beginning of something. And it's something beautiful that the Lord will use your child's life to help someone else. And that's pretty amazing, what you've been able to do so far with the Lord's help.
I do occasionally get letters, and the ones I get are always very, very nice. Unfortunately, I don't know most of the people I help. They're usually fairly anonymous to me, and they're vetted. But they do eventually take the time, some of them, to write a note and say I changed their life. And I got one particularly the other day from someone that just said, that because the folks that when I started Kristen Kelly's Hope, one of the things I made clear of is I remember I spent a few $100,000 on rehabs on my son, and then they had boarding schools which aren't cheap. So unfortunately, rehab facilities programs have a poor batting average. The age of first use is a very big indicator of long-term addiction. On the other hand, length of time in treatment is a very big indicator of future chances of sobriety. So what we try to do is, there's organizations like Beach House Recovery in Sunset Beach, with a Christian-based nonprofit, a Christian-based group in Sumter, Any Length Recovery. These kind of groups that I didn't really realize existed. I'm looking at the Karen Foundation, I'm looking at Betty Ford, I'm looking at these places that I read about, and I really was an island unto myself. The other thing I always tell parents is there's a lot of information out there, and there's a whole lot of information now because once a week someone dies of a drug overdose. Unfortunately. So you hear about places where you can send your kids. Immediately when someone calls me, I'll first of all say, look, I'm so sorry to hear about this. I truly am, and I'm going to pray for you. But I do want you to know that I'm a father, parent, and I'm not an addictionologist. And I said, so things have changed since it's been 15 years since my second son died. So I said, rehabilitation facilities change, things like that. I said, now I do know places, because in the beginning I said I'm not going to use anybody's money that I raise to support individuals alone. Until someone came to me, a very nice man out of Myrtle Beach. He was head of the department. It's funny how all these things tie together, but it was a father of a girl who has just gotten into medical school at Yale. But she and my second son Kelly went to St. Joseph's High School together.
Wow.
But her parents were divorced, and her father was in Myrtle Beach, so I never really knew him. But when Nikki Haley, the long story short about this whole thing, and I was starting my foundation and everything, and raising money, when 2008 came along and the economy went in the toilet, a lot of what Nikki Haley cuts did was it cut a lot of social service budgets, and one of them, the mental health department, had a voucher that said, a lot of people walk into the mental health departments these days, and they still do, and they say, I'm mentally ill. Well, no, you're not really mentally ill, but you are. You're addicted to drugs, or you're an alcoholic is what it is. But we can still help you. And they used to give them a voucher to go to an Any Length Recovery or some kind of Christian-based facility. So that voucher went away. So when that voucher went away, this gentleman started calling me, and I initially said, my mission was not to help people individually. But then I started thinking about, well, am I really going to let $1,000 be the difference between someone trying again? Because these folks, and normally they're in their early 20s to mid 20s, they've ticked off all their relatives, ticked off all their friends. They're scratching plastic. They don't have jobs. They're going to have to start thinking about stealing to surviving. They've been to rehab 4, 5, 6 times, hasn't worked. And and these are the guys that are really sunk to the bottom. And unfortunately, that's when you sink to the bottom. Sometimes people say, the only alternative I have here is to pray my way out of this thing. And I'm more than happy then to give them $1,000 or $1,200 they need to do that. So, for instance, at Beach House Recovery, I've got 4 guys there now that have been there. One's been there for 14 months, and he's running the joint and loves it. He leads the group in prayer every day, and so it's great to hear that kind of thing. But you with the disease of addiction, you never, because you guys have had friends probably who've heard this. Oh man, he went to addiction he went away for a year. He came 2 weeks later, he was dead because he got home and he used one time. And you hear that story, that breaks my heart. It just breaks my heart that happens.
You mentioned when we were talking a little while ago, you said the devil had a big suitcase, and he's got all these different ways that he tries to trip you up, and he tries, especially if you're dealing with addiction. There's already so many other temptations out there, but even if you're not dealing with addiction, you talked about starting early and having that relationship with your children and focusing on, I guess, protecting them in all the ways that you can. What advice would you give specifically to a father, as that's what this podcast is about, but just to parents in general, about how to build that relationship with their children to be able to have those conversations, whether it's about drugs, whether it's about a lustful relationship that leads to estrangement from family members, whether it's about stealing, just getting in with the wrong crowd. How would you advise someone to build that relationship with their child that they can find out early when things like this are happening, and then can have that rapport and have that respect to be able to discuss these things honestly with their children?
I think you hit it on the end. Last thing you said about speaking honestly with each other, communication. Talk about, hey son, you shouldn't use drugs or alcohol. That's not what you just kind of say, unless you have to start saying that. But I'm talking about from an early age, we would sit at the kitchen table, at the dinner table, and we would talk about things. And they were things that were probably, and I guess it was because I had a relationship with my parents that it was very open about what I was doing, and I wasn't doing a lot of bad things, and I thought about them, but I never to do them. I was very involved in athletics, and that's the other thing I try to tell people, that we also give things that promote healthy activities. There's a lot of things that go down between 3:30 and 6:30 at night, and that's when your son or daughter is home from school. And parents today are both working, and they're not home till 6 or 6:30. Well, that 3-hour window is when the stuff goes down. And if we can encourage, that's why I give to Junior Achievement. That's why I give to Boy Scouts of America, Girl Scouts of America, organizations like that, Christian groups that promote healthy activities after school. It's a thing about staying busy and doing healthy things. So we always talked about staying busy, doing healthy things. We always communicated, even as hard as it might sound. Sometimes we did have some conversation with my wife. Would grab my leg under the table and say, just kind of be careful what you're saying here now, Steve. About different things, and because the kids will tell you, kids will say strange things to you sometimes that they hear. So I always tell folks to have a very, very strong communication and take a genuine interest in what's going on in their lives. And because a lot of times we don't, and especially with two parents, things like that. There's enough problems in our own relationships with our spouses, and sometimes we neglect our kids, and they're telling us something. Sometimes they're saying something to you, but they're choosing other words to really tell it. And that's a lot of times how it is when you're on the phone with someone. When I was doing the suicide crisis counseling, is they're describing something to you, and they're telling you. So I had a friend who attempted suicide, and just because of the training, he kept saying to me, "Steve, I'm not sure when I'm going to see you again. Maybe I'm not sure when I'm starting." I said, "Well, John, wait a second. What do you mean you're not sure you're going to see me again? What does that mean?" They say that people who are going to commit suicide, they are telling you well in advance that this is what's going to happen.
Wow.
You're just not picking up on it. We're not trained to understand it. The other thing I said a lot about the communication and keeping up with their kids and understanding where they are and who they're with. But the other is always let them know you love them, because at some point, I think kids that fall into drugs and things like that, they think these other horrible people love them, and their family doesn't love them. And those other horrible people, they don't really love them. They love what they're doing for them or getting to them, but they don't love them. And I always, and as weird as it sounds, I always tell people at the end of our conversation, make sure you let your son or your daughter know they love them. And unfortunately, it's a lot of it's boys. You don't hear about this as girls. Girls is more of a mental health issue sometimes, more than a substance issue. But it does happen.
Yeah, last night I was watching Chris Farley documentary on A&E, and that was one of the things that they said, like, some of his old SNL cast members, they were saying that as things got kind of worse for him, with his addiction, David Spade in particular, he said, he's like, he just kind of pushed people like me away because he didn't have time for me anymore. He was like, but unfortunately he had all these other people around him that were just not good for him. He was like, and all his old buddies like me, he wouldn't let us into his circle anymore. And like you said, those are the ones he was afraid.
Those are the ones that are going to tell him that he's really not doing good right now. And that's what you don't want to hear, really.
Yeah,
I see my friends, my son's friends, still, especially my first son, who had that more classic addiction thing, and I see them, and some of them have done very, very well. Some of my son's friends they've changed their life. Their death has changed their lives. One gave up heroin like that, and that's a very hard thing to do.
Wow.
After my son, and then unfortunately, you hear the story about people whose friends die of drug overdose, and they were lying there next to him on the same floor. They were at the same party with him, and I woke up and he didn't. Why does that happen? I think I'm going to stop. Well, I stopped for 2 or 3 days until the next Saturday comes along, and they're back again, which always blows my mind.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned that. I was just about to go into, and we've been planning to do some podcasts and just tell our own testimonies, but my testimony very shortly involves growing up in a Christian home. Things were good. We always heard these, don't do drugs, don't hang around the wrong crowd, all these things. And I had a good relationship with my parents. But I went to college here in South Carolina, and I was free, and I could do whatever I wanted to do, and I got into drinking and some, I guess, more recreational drugs, and I kind of had the mindset, like, whatever there is, I've never tried it before, so I should just, see if it's fun, see if it's good. And a lot of it was fun, for a time. And my testimony revolves around, like, coming to that point where I realized, like, there's nothing more to this. There's nothing lasting to this. It's always, like, you're seeking that next high, and then when you come down, you're, oh, okay, well, I guess I just need to go and drink some more, and then I'll feel good for 8 hours, and then I'll feel bad the next morning, and then I try again. But I had a fraternity brother who actually died of an alcohol overdose, and it was a very similar thing, like you say, that the culture in our friend group was kind of, drink till you pass out, and it was just, it was all fun. We're all 19, 20, 21, and everyone just hangs out, and you drink whatever you can get your hands on, and then at the end of the night, you're stumbling around, and you're like, I'm going to find a place to pass out. And he passed out on a couch in our fraternity house, and essentially he vomited and suffocated, and he was found, did CPR for an hour probably, and they got there, they resuscitated him a few times in the ambulance, and then he passed away, and they weren't able to bring him back. And that was one of those things, like you said, that people, we had probably 40 guys in our fraternity and several more that hung around and kind of lived that same lifestyle, and it was something that, clearly it was like, we thought we were invincible. We were like, we can do this as much as we want, nothing bad could happen to us. And there was this kind of dual mindset that, like, it shattered that innocence or that ignorance, but at the same time it was that, like, we stopped for a day or two, and then it was like, well, that was just a freak thing, just one of those weird things where we both drink the same amount and he just didn't wake up, so it probably won't happen again. And as far as I know, most guys went back to that same lifestyle within a few days or a week. And I think that's part of that is being young and not having wisdom, not having that foresight or that ability to, or that willingness to sit down and reflect on things. And I think part of it is our fallen nature, where you're searching for that next fun thing, that next high, that like being part of that group, like you mentioned. And you know, a lot of the guys that I still talk to that were in that same group have grown up and straightened up, and you know, may still have a relationship with alcohol, but it's in moderation, and they're productive individuals. But there are some other guys too, you know, who may not have gone that way. And
You
that's
know,
a
it's
tough
funny.
thing.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I talked to the groups I dislike talking to, or I shouldn't say dislike. I like at least talking to our kids and teenagers, high school groups. I get frustrated sometimes with them. One, because they're always either on their iPads or you know, or they're doing something on social media while they're talking to me. And I also know that they're hearing me, and 9 out of 10 are saying, "Well, this is not going to happen to me."
Yeah.
You know, and then occasionally, I was at a charter school one time, and a girl came up and she was crying, and I knew that that was the key. Again, I'm a parent, so that bring them to the resource officer, because obviously there was a reason she was crying, and that's a good effect. But the thing that always bothers me, and I grew up in this environment, we were not legalistic. You know, my father, there was alcohol in my house. Both of my parents drank in very much in moderation, very responsibly. But I knew what the drinking age was, you know. And I never smoked a cigarette in my life, but I knew what the smoking age was. It's like we just kind of don't know what that age is anymore. You know, and these kids are drinking and using drugs. And there's nothing wrong with drinking as long as you drink in moderation and you're older than 21. But you know, most of these kids drinking starts long before that. You know,
And like you say, there's no moderation.
and
It's
it's
just
like, okay, what happened about being a law?
yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
so would you go rob a bank?
Mm-hmm.
You know, I mean, really, I mean, I just said that's something very frustrating to me.
Yeah.
And that was the first thing I always tell my kids. I said, you know, first of all, you should be drinking. Secondly, you know, you're breaking the law, actually. You know, and I guess I could have someone come over here and arrest you. You know, they'd probably end up arresting me. You know, instead of you.
Yeah, I think that's, you know, like you say, it's a lack of respect in general, and that's a much deeper subject that's going on in our society today. But I think that's something that, you know, like you said, it can, I would imagine in a lot of circumstances, it starts in the house, that there's, you know, you either have parents who don't have respect for authority, or they don't have that relationship with the children for the children to respect the parents' authority and understand that relationship. And I think that's something that as Christians we should try to model in our home, that we are as men are the head of our household, but we're under the authority of the Lord, and we should go where He leads us, and we should lead our family along that as well. And I think something that you mentioned earlier is, you know, about starting to build that consistency in that relationship with your children early. When you mentioned these groups that people are either are currently pregnant or they have very little children, and I think that's something that, just from what I'm hearing from you and what I'm thinking about as we're talking about this, that would be a great piece of advice for new fathers, or for fathers that are, you know, maybe lost a child and they're trying to have a relationship with their children that they still have here, that build that relationship with the Lord, between you and the Lord, and then model that to your children and show them, you know, I'm not out here doing whatever I want to do. I'm under the authority of the Lord. You're under my authority. That's the way of the world, the way it should be. And when there's order, there's comfort, and there's peace, and you understand, you know, day to day what's expected of you. And it's just and you become a much more productive member of society. You know, it's hard to be a good employee when you're doing whatever you want to do and you don't care what your boss has to say. And so I think there's a lot of wisdom in that, to have that relationship with authority and to model it well. And I wanted to ask you too, you know, talking about alcohol and things like that, you mentioned that you had some trouble dealing with that yourself, and I think to me that resonates because, like I mentioned, my relationship with alcohol was very poor in my early 20s. And when we lost our child, I remember thinking very distinctly, like, it would be so easy. Like, I want to go back to that lifestyle and to drink, to numb the pain, to marijuana was my favorite thing back when I was in college. It kind of just numbs your pain, and you feel good and relaxed. And there was such a temptation there. Like, I know where I can get it, and I can go get that, and I'd feel good.
Yeah.
And would you speak a little bit to just why that's not a good way to try to handle that, and why is it destructive rather than helpful if you try to deal with your pain with alcohol or another drug?
Well, I think the biggest reason is those are very effective drugs actually for depression and to calm you and maybe to escape. But they have terrible side effects. Obviously, I couldn't. It's began to affect my ability to do my job at work. You could just feel yourself sliding. And I remember my parents coming to visit me because they were very concerned about me. My second son had already gone back to Birmingham to go to school, and I would be in the garage. I would live in this neighborhood, Chanticleer in Greenville, and we I would always sit in the backyard, and I would be drinking in the backyard. And I always felt like I was being responsible because I wouldn't get behind the wheel of the car. I wouldn't leave. So my mom came over one day, and my father drove over from the little town they lived in, South Carolina. They had moved down here about 20 years prior from New Jersey, and my mom saw this big barrel, one of those, those big green barrels full of these big bottles of liquor. To the end, she said, "Steve, what's going on here? You starting a liquor store? You got a trophy collection going on here? What's going on?" And it kind of hit me, at that point. And I said, she said, "You're not drinking all this alcohol, are you?" And I said, "Yeah, I am." And she said, "Wow." I'd gotten to the point where, I think you get sick and tired of being sick and tired. And you come to the realization that, this was not going to be the answer. And I think, fortunately, I was not getting the side effects, the unhealthy side effects. It was more at that point I was just like, okay, Steve, now it's time to, grab hold here and do what you know you need to do. And this is not how you solve this issue. But it is interesting how it is really easy to go in that direction.
Yeah.
And it'll become more and more easy. Unfortunately, we will legalize marijuana in South Carolina eventually. We'll go down kicking and screaming, but it's going to happen. And when that happens, and maybe it does have medicinal uses, or proven that it is, but there are people, when the button gets pushed in your head, it gets pushed. And I remember driving around with my children in the car, and these are these open conversations we'd have, and I'd say, guys, you're from a long line of drunks. My grandmother died of alcoholism. My mother was an alcoholic. Her brothers were alcoholics. Your mom's side of the family was all kinds of alcohol issues. I said, unfortunately, the cards are stacked against you, and you're going to like something. One day you're going to like something, and then you're going to have to try to figure out, that's how you're going to have to deal with it. And unfortunately for my older son Christopher, who loved marijuana, just loved her. I always say Christopher would be in his heyday today because he'd be out in Colorado someplace or Massachusetts, and he'd be loving life. But he loved marijuana, and that was his downfall. And you hear all these things about, well, marijuana is not really the problem. Well, for the right person, it is the problem. It is a gatekeeper drug for the right person. For a lot of people, it's not. They can just put it down. Same thing with alcohol, but I think it's going to get worse. And I think I would tell my kids the button's going to get pushed. And unfortunately, my second son, the button never got pushed. He drank some beer, he smoked some marijuana, but it was not. Someone led him to heroin. Boom. And it was like, his friends told me it was like the rocket ship went off. And that just was a stunner.
Yes, sir. Well, I was going to say, just we've been going about an hour, and we really appreciate your
Yeah.
time with us. But in kind of as we start to wrap this up, we got to ask 2 questions.
And I want to ask you guys a question.
Okay, all right, you go first.
Can I go first?
Yes, sir.
I always contemplate, I always thought, I don't think about it this often, but I certainly thought about driving up here is, would I rather have had my sons alive with me for 21 to 24 years than to be alive with me for 21 minutes?
I think we probably had those
and which
discussions.
one, and which one
Yeah.
hurts more than the other? You know?
Yeah, I think, and I'll let you speak too, Gabe. But I think for me, just from my experience, anytime you lose a child, you've lost something that it's hard to describe. And in a certain sense, from my perspective of having a child that was stillborn and never actually holding him or talking to him while he was alive, I wish that I did get a year, a month, 20 years to spend with him and get to know who he was, get to know his personality and things like that. But at the same time, there's something in me that is glad that he didn't have to experience the brokenness and the suffering in this world. He never had to scrape his knee. He never got his heart broken. You know, he never failed a test. You know, he never had any just terrible experience and never had to experience the sin in this world. And I think there's something that I hold on to that's helpful about that. But we also, Gabe and I both losing children very young. We initially started this podcast, at least I know I did, thinking that's what our podcast was going to be about, was infant loss and stillbirth and very early child loss. And that's what we're familiar with. But we started thinking and talking and talking to you, I kind of got to thinking, obviously I don't know because my son was stillborn, but whether your child is stillborn or 10 years old or 50, 60 years old, you still lost a part of yourself. And it's something that it can't compare to the loss of a spouse, the loss of a friend, a sibling. It's something that is totally unique in the world of grief. And I think regardless of how old your child is, it's a hole in you that can't be filled in any way other than trusting the Lord. And that's what I feel.
It's got to be as traumatic it is for you. It's got to be doubly traumatic for your spouse.
Mm-hmm. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. And I'll let you speak to that too, Gabe.
Yeah, I mean, I would say we had those conversations. You know, my wife and I.
Yeah.
Because what we lost was the ideal that we had set up, right? Of this is what their nursery is going to look like, and you know, this is the stroller that we're going to pick out, and you know, all these. This is the vacations we're going to take them on. All these things that you have planned, you know, for your future, that didn't come to pass. And so then we would think, on the other side of that, well, aren't we blessed that it sounds crazy, but that we didn't know them as well as somebody that lost a kid when they were 20, 21, 29, whatever, and then have all those years together and all those memories together. We lost the idea of having memories, but we didn't lose those memories, right? The memories we had with them were short, you know, like again, a day, 3 weeks, 3 months. And so it came to the point where we're like, we don't know which would be more difficult. You know, I think oftentimes I think it would be more difficult to lose an adult child, you know, or a child in their teens or they're 8, 9, 10 years old, because of, you know, them so much better. You know, I mean, obviously I think the loss of Reese, our first one, was awful because it was so difficult and traumatic and you just didn't expect it, kind of thing. I mean, we should have because of her condition, but still being so idealistic, I was just like, she's going to be fine. She's going to make it. And then, you know, second child, okay, she also sick, but we knew her a little bit better, you know, 3 weeks. And then when the last one died, you know, only 3 months, but we had a lot more memories with, you know, Sophia than we had with Reese. And so I'm thinking that all having that time was probably harder when she was finally gone, and that was it, you know, that it was, I think that was harder even than Reese passing the first one. So, I think it's just not easy, you know, either way. And I like what you said, because a part of you is gone, as well. And so I just, so that's where we're at with that. So I would like to ask two questions.
Yeah.
And thank you for asking that question.
Yeah.
Because just,
Yeah, I think
makes
that's
you
a
think.
question that's hard to answer.
Yeah.
Unless you, and hopefully no one ever experienced this, but unless you lost a child that was stillborn and you lost a 20-year-old, I don't know how you could ever answer that question.
Right.
Go ahead, Gabe.
Well, I'll say first is, what is the most important thing that you would like for us to hear from you or our listeners to hear about how we trust God when we deal with the loss of a child?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And then secondly, after that, if you could just run through one more time, how do we connect with you, your books, your ministry, your websites, that kind of thing?
Sure. Well, the first question is hard. Is easy in some respects and hard in others, because I do rely a great deal on my faith and how it gets me through. Every day. I pray that. Right now, I have my father-in-law, who's the pastor I was telling you about, who's 90, who actually is living in my house in a hospital bed, and he's passing away. And obviously, I pray for him. I actually pray that the Lord will take him, because it's time, and he's ready to do that. And I pray he meets my children when he gets up there, because he's never met my children. But I'll tell you what's kind of interesting about my and it's something that I try to talk to my wife about a little bit, but it's hard for me to kind of gather the words. One, she never had children, so she didn't, though she laughs that she, whenever we go to some kind of event, someone's going to say, well, hey, sorry about your children, to her. And she used to have to explain that these weren't her. I'm not the mother of these kids. But now she just says thank you to them. I told her, I said, much easier just to say thank you, Kathy. But I don't know about you guys, but I so believe that the Lord had a plan for me and for my family. That I am almost a little insensitive sometimes about death and about other people's tragedies. I don't like, and not that I don't, I mourn with them and I grieve for them, but I have this true belief that this has to be a plan. There has to be a plan. I can't imagine somebody wanting to take away my two kids from me in the prime of their life, prime of my life. Unless it was the plan to happen.
Yes, sir.
And the continuation of that plan was for me to do these things and to help others, so it might not happen to them.
Mm-hmm. Yes, sir. That's awesome. So have belief that there's that plan. I love that, and having that faith to believe that.
Yeah. Would you, like Gabe said, would you just, as we close out here, run us through again the Chris and Kelly Hope Foundation?
One more thing, when I sign my book, and I haven't signed this one, I always put down Luke 12:48, and I think about that a lot, and it's there's a couple different variations of it, but it basically means too much is to those that much is given, much is expected.
Wow. Yeah.
And I've been given a lot. So I want to help give back.
Yeah,
that's awesome.
That's cool. Yeah.
I'll throw in one quick thing in regards to that scripture. First time I had a book signing, and my family was friends with the Wallingtons from Christian Supply, and had been for years. So he graciously allowed me to come over there and do that back in 2012, and I was like, I'm gonna put a Bible verse, in my, and so it was like my grandma and all her friends, and then her friends' friends. It's how that goes. It was just people that were trying to support us as a family, right? It came out that day. So I was writing this Bible verse in and signing it. Get done with the day, go home. I'm sitting there on the couch. Like, I remember I was getting ready to teach Sunday school the next day, and like all of a sudden I just went, oh no. And my wife looked at me and she was like, why is your face red? You just got like all flushed. Got the verse wrong. I looked it up. It was supposed to be where Jesus says, not my will but yours be done. And instead, the verse I had written was, he gave them 2 broiled fish. So, man, I had to run back up to Christian Supply. I'd left some other books. I was like, give me those books that I...
Yeah, you know, when I'm even writing it out for someone right in front of me, I always sit there and hesitate a little bit. And that's why I looked it up on my phone a second ago when we first started.
That's awesome.
But, you know, thank you for for being here. And, you know, anybody, I'm always very accessible. If anybody ever wants to talk or thinks they have an issue, you know, I get calls about, Steve, I found marijuana in my son's jeans when I was getting ready to put him in the wash machine. And I'd say, you know, in and of itself, I certainly would concern myself about that. And I would certainly approach him about it or her about it and say, you know, why is this here? And I better not find it again. Okay, and from now on, you know, your bags are going to stay downstairs and things like that. You know, so things are going to. But I to say that your son or daughter has an alcohol or a marijuana problem is probably not true. Okay, and I say, and so they say, well, when does that really happen, Steve? And I say, you know, it happens when your son or daughter's life begins to be, the decisions they make are being controlled by those things. They're not going to school on time. They're not at baseball practice. They're not home when they're supposed to be. You know, things that they normally, something else is making a decision for them, and that's the number one question I hear, is how do I know? And I think that's the best thing to really observe is, are they really getting out of their the normal decisions they're making and making them differently. But you can always find me on my website is www.chriskellyhope.com. I'm on Facebook too, and I'm on Instagram at Don't Forget Me Book, and we have that website, and we have a great fitness park in Grangeville on the Swamp Rabbit Trail to go by and visit there.
That's awesome. Cool. Thank you so much, and Will he'll put that information like in the description and whatnot. So
I'll when we get the podcast up, I'll post on our social media, and we'll link your social media.
Yeah, and my phone numbers are there in every place, and my email addresses, and I get back to people very quickly.
Great. Well, thank you, Mr. Grant, for your time. And thank you for listening to us today. We hope that you have heard something that's helpful and encouraging, and that you just continue to seek the Lord through your experience with your child, and whether you're going through it now or you've gone through it in the past. Make sure you follow us on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter at Lost Boys to Found Fathers. You can check out Gabe's book at thywillbedonebook.com. And remember, you don't have to be lost. Let's be found in Him.